Howdy, everybody. So we're going to pick up kind of the tail end of Reagan, get into George Bush Sr., so the first Bush presidency, and then talk about the end of the Cold War. And then we'll probably leave off looking at the war on terror. So when we last left off, we were talking about kind of this new age in the 1980s, things that had changed. We talked about different political and economic changes. We also talked about social and technological changes. So now we're going to kind of pick up with that. So we're looking at society. So the 1980s were kind of known as the year of the yuppie. So to kind of explain what a yuppie is, these are guys that are very focused on business, all this kinds of stuff. They kind of give you an easy way to measure the change in how people saw the world. So when college students were asked in the mid-1960s what their biggest goal was, 80% said it was to, quote, develop a meaningful philosophy of life. So you can definitely see a very clear goal. It wasn't to get rich, it wasn't to do things, it was just to have a meaningful life. By the mid-1980s, 71% now said the goal was to be financially well off. So these yuppies, these are young men, young women that are chasing wealth, glorifying it, and it's celebrated in a whole new way. So the materialism that started, like we talked about in the 1950s and 60s, has grown by the time we get to the 1980s, and it's becoming an integrated way of American life. Now, things were doing okay under Reagan, particularly after the kind of economic troubles of Carter. So people were able to make more money than ever before. People are doing better off. But there are some reasons during the Reagan era to be cynical. So the first major one, so there's the year of the yuppie, but the first major one is the Iran-Contra Affair. Now, in 1986, news leaked out that the administration, the Reagan administration, had negotiated an arms for hostage deal with the revolutionary government of Iran, the same government that Reagan had denounced during the 1980s hostage crisis. Now, you see, there's a number of hostages being held in Lebanon. And the United States and the CIA think that if we can convince Iran to talk to Lebanon on our behalf, that will help get the hostages out of Lebanon. But Iran wants something from us. They want guns. So the CIA secretly sells guns to Iran in order to get them to help us with the hostages in Lebanon. But there's an additional problem. The CIA has illegally sold guns to an enemy nation, to Iran, and now they have this cash. They don't know what to do with that. So they take that cash and they give it to the Contra rebels in Nicaragua. Now, Nicaragua had a democratically elected government, just that government was not in line with the United States. It was a communist government, and we weren't thrilled with that. So we were funding rebels to overthrow that government because we thought that might be more politically in line with the United States. So to break this down for you once again, we were secretly selling military weapons to our enemy, Iran, then using the profits from that secret fund to secretly fund an insurgency in Nicaragua and overthrow their democratically elected government. Now, I have a link to a video called American Made, and it has like a part of this. And it talks about the growing of the drug cartels and like that that's tangentially related to the Iran-Contra affair. So I highly recommend watching it, but keep that in mind. Now, does all of this sound stupid and illegal? Yeah, very much so. This is a terrible idea. No one should have been doing it, but they did. And when it got out and people got a hold of it, there were congressional hearings, there was a big uproar and hullabaloo about it, and the star witness, Lieutenant Oliver North, was put on the stand. When he found out there would be an investigation, he quickly shredded hundreds of documents trying to eliminate any evidence of the actual crime. But somehow he missed a crucial memo that linked the scandal all the way up to the White House, meaning that the president probably knew what was going on. And apparently, the approval to do this dumb thing had come directly from the Reagan White House. Now, Reagan had a great answer whenever asked about it. He just said, "I don't remember." Now, who knows if he really didn't remember, if he was just playing senile old man card and saying, I don't know. But nonetheless, surprisingly, the strategy worked. No one really went after Reagan too hard. No one really kind of targeted him for not stopping this kind of stupid idea. Now, there's another thing that Reagan didn't really respond to very well, and that's going to be the AIDS HIV crisis, because it's during Reagan's term as president that you have the first big outbreak of HIV and AIDS during the 1980s. Now, this is going to hit the gay community first before it hits any other outside community. Now, because it initially hit the gay community first, Reagan and the US didn't really do much to help. They didn't devote the research to it. And you get propaganda posters like this calling Reagan a silent killer because he didn't do more to help the gay community when it was relegated primarily to the gay community. So this is a fundamental kind of black mark against Reagan and his presidency. Now, let's talk about some of the legacies of Reagan during the 1980s. So in 1981, he appointed the first woman to serve on the Supreme Court, Sandra Day O'Connor. He also appointed several other justices as well. He cut taxes across the board and then cut many social and welfare programs that we talked about. But he never touched Medicare or Social Security. He ramped up military spending, mostly on that big Star Wars program with all the new technologies. He helped establish the power of this new right within the Republican Party, this religious, conservative powerhouse that serves as a base for the Republican Party today. Then you have the rising of U.S. national debt, and this is going to dramatically increase our debt. Remember, in California, when he was the governor of California, he cut taxes, spent money to improve the nation or improve the state. When he got to the United States as president, he cut taxes and then spent money. So in California, they had a surplus because they raised taxes. But in the United States, as a large, when Reagan was president, our debt increased because we were spending money despite not bringing any more money in. So this is going to be a major shift happening during 1985, during Reagan's tenure. For the first time since 1915, the United States became a debtor nation rather than a creditor nation, meaning we owed other countries more than other countries owed us. So with astonishing speed, the United States had accumulated the world's largest foreign debt. And this puts the United States in a scary and precarious problem that we are still finding ourselves in today. Now, for all of his flaws, Reagan did have some good mindsets. So we talked about some of the good stuff he's already done. But Reagan on immigration was probably one of the best things. He said, you can go to live in Germany, Turkey, or Japan, but you cannot become German, Turkish, or Japanese. But anyone from any corner of the earth can come to live in America and become an American. And this is a wonderful mindset, something that, he's one of the founding fathers, one of the big overarching figures in the Republican Party. This is an idea that has not persisted in the Republican Party today, at least not to the same degree, but it's something that he seemed to believe. So he has these interesting kind of juxtapositions of ideas and emotions at that point in time. Now, Reagan remained incredibly popular, and the New Right coalition remained as strong as ever. And so the Republican Party turned in 1988 to Reagan's loyal vice president, George H.W. Bush, as their nominee in 1988. Now, let's kind of backtrack a little bit and talk about Bush's early life. He was born into a wealthy New England family, had gone to Yale, and had become a World War II hero. Now, his plane was shot down during the war, and afterwards, he generally did well for himself. Now, he initially comes to Texas during the late 1940s and got into the oil business. And this made him wealthy in his own right. And by the mid-1960s, he was a millionaire and has turned his sights towards political office. So there's George H.W. Bush with little w right next to him. Now, in 1966, he won an election to the U.S. House of Representatives, and his career in politics took off from there. He served in the UN as the head of the CIA and as an envoy to China. And by the late 1970s, Bush was a rising star in the Republican Party. And he challenged Ronald Reagan for the Republican presidential nomination in 1980 to run against Jimmy Carter, but Reagan was simply too popular. Now, Reagan won the nomination, but chose Bush as his presidential running mate. And this is going to be a powerhouse because Reagan from California is going to have the state with one of the largest electoral college votes by pairing him with Bush, who's from Texas, which is the second largest electoral college votes. So you have the two biggest states creating a powerhouse of a ticket, because those states will typically vote for their representatives or their candidates. Now, Bush, in 1988, when he runs for president, he's running on the momentum of Reagan's presidency. The slogan for the campaign had been taken from Bush's acceptance speech at the Republican nomination convention. Read my lips, no new taxes. Now, I put that video, and you kind of see what he's talking about there, but this is his big thing, no new taxes. Reagan had cut taxes. Bush says, I'm going to keep them cut. We'll see how that plays out for Bush. Now, Bush is facing off against a former governor of Massachusetts, a rather bland guy at times, a guy named Michael Dukakis, who proved to be a rather ineffective opponent for Bush. Now, Bush proved to be entirely relentless, and the most infamous moment of the campaign was something called the Willie Horton ad that basically implied that Dukakis had let out a murderer in order to allow him to rape and murder some more. So this is the first scene of the Willie Horton ad, but I linked it on Blackboard as well, so you can take a look at that. It is shocking. It's kind of like Johnson's Daisy ad. It's one of those things you don't see a lot, but it's shocking when you do see them. Now, Bush is going to win in another new right landslide, 53% of the vote to 45%. It wasn't even really close. Now, unfortunately for Bush Sr., he inherited a bit of an economic mess from Reagan. Now, you see, there's something called the Balanced Budget Act, passed in 1985 and signed by Reagan, no less, which stipulated that there would be automatic budget cuts to the federal budget if the deficit did not start going down by 1991. Well, you can't keep the budget down if you keep spending on defense and other things and also keep taxes cut. The math doesn't work out. Something's got to give. Either you have to raise taxes or you have to cut spending. So facing a halt in non-essential government services and layoffs of thousands of governmental employees, the Congress was forced to cut a ton of programs and initiate one of the largest tax increases in American history. Now, this is all brought about by Reagan's policies finally coming to fruition, but the problem was they came to their end point during Bush's term. So Bush looks like he had a detrimental effect on the U.S. economy. His inability to avoid these new taxes earned him the enmity of many people across America, including many Republicans from his own party. Now, between 1980 and 1990, the national debt had swelled from about 50% of personal savings to 125% by 1990. That means of all the savings in the United States, so everybody, you, me, everybody, all of our personal savings combined, we now have 125% of that in national debt, meaning even if we gave all of our money to the government still had 25% more debt than we could pay off. Now, in other places, Bush is going to do things. So the debt is not going great, but other programs like the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA. Now, this is going to be huge. This is what provides ramps and ADA accommodations as well as workplace accommodations. This is going to be a massive step forward for people with disabilities of all kinds. And this is going to be one of the most influential things and one of the most life-altering things that makes the United States one of the best countries to live if you have a disability. Now, elsewhere, as we're dealing with the economics at home, pushing forth the ADA, you have the first Gulf War breaking out. This is kind of the other major defining event of Bush Sr.'s administration. This is the first Gulf War. So on August 2nd, 1990, the Iraqi army of Saddam Hussein invaded the oil-rich kingdom of Kuwait. And this is going to be a fundamental problem for the United States. Now, Bush took a hardline stance against Saddam's aggression. He spent a lot of time and money getting support of the United States, Arab and Middle Eastern nations, and worldwide support for the counter-intervention, kind of going to the UN to get permission to go in, liberate Kuwait, and push Saddam Hussein's forces out. Now, the military outcome of our invasion in January 1991 was a massive success. So we went in, it was very quick, but the question was, do we push on and after liberating Kuwait, go into Baghdad? Do we keep pushing? Now, this wasn't part of our mandate by the UN, so Bush said, no, we're not going to go in. And as we will see, it's going to end up being his son, when he takes over as president, that's going to have to deal with some of the results left in the Gulf. So let's kind of switch over, talk about the end of the Cold War. We're going to go back in time a little bit, kind of recap what we've covered, how we got to this point, and we'll end with how Bush kind of oversees the final collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. Now, if you'll remember, Reagan took kind of this hard line against the Soviet Union at first, but that begins kind of softening over time. Eventually, he met with Mikhail Gorbachev in person starting in 1985, and the two actually became fairly good friends. And he kept pushing Gorbachev to try to make changes. And in June of 1987, he's going to give a speech before the Berlin Wall. And Reagan is going to make kind of one of the most famous speeches of his life, wherein he said, quote, "General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate, Mr. Gorbachev. Open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." So I have the speech linked in Blackboard as well, so you can go and listen to a more complete version of it with some commentary. But this is a challenge, kind of a friendly challenge, but a challenge nonetheless to say, let's liberalize the Soviet Union, let's open it up to the rest of the world. And Gorbachev, for his part, really does want to open things up, wants to change things. And things in the Soviet Union aren't great. Your economy kind of stinks. There's not much else you can do about it. So people were poor. They didn't think a whole lot of the Soviet system as a result of, it was kind of rotting from the inside out. So when Gorbachev tried to open up the USSR to the wider world, in 1988, he told the UN and the nations of Eastern Europe that they were now free for self-determination. So they could choose their own destiny. They didn't have to have a Soviet system if they didn't want to. And so the old Soviet order quickly crumbled as countries like Poland immediately held elections and declared themselves democracies, in direct contrast with the old Soviet system. As importantly, East Germany eased the barriers to travel to the West, and there was a flood of communication and migration and reconnecting of families that had been divided by that Berlin Wall. Now, the most dramatic effect and visible reminder of the end of the Cold War came with the fall of the Berlin Wall, which was initially kind of accidental because there was supposed to be an easing of communication and movement between the two borders, not a true opening of the gates. But someone misunderstood, the gates got opened, and then people started moving easily between East and West Berlin and East and West Germany. So the walls just came down, and they officially tore down these walls. Now, this was the most visible symbol of the end of the Cold War that played out on live television. And so the Soviet Union crumbled into pieces. In 1990, Gorbachev announced the Communist Party would no longer have a monopoly in Russia. And after that, the Soviet Union crumbled and fell apart. And it was a rapid and remade landscape of the world after this moment. So let's recap again. So how do we get here? So we talked about kind of Truman and Eisenhower were the very beginnings of the Cold War, and then Kennedy kind of took it to the highest level in 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis. After that, things kind of calm back down. Then Johnson ramps it back up with Vietnam. And it's going to be Nixon that really starts kind of easing some of these tensions, partially in Vietnam as he brings Vietnamization and things like that, partially with China, offering the olive branch as well as détente, kind of reaching out to Russia themselves. Reagan will for a short time ratchet things up with that kind of space and arms race with Russia, but after befriending Mikhail Gorbachev, actually begins to calm things back down on the flip side. And so ultimately we outlast the Russians. And this is how the Cold War ended. The USSR rotted from within. There's Bush and Gorbachev meeting kind of at the tail end of the Cold War. So what you have to understand is we did not win the Cold War militarily. All our military interventions did nothing to genuinely win the Cold War. We won it economically. Our system was in fact better than the Soviet Union system. So communist socialism under the Soviet Union's kind of model did not work. Capitalism under the democratic system of the US worked far better. And that is how we win. And this brings us kind of into the 1990s. And you're having this whole big change. Like the 80s were a rapid change, so were the 90s. And probably the single biggest thing is going to be personal computers that we touched on last class. But now something new is coming to these personal computers, something we're using right now, just so y'all can watch this video. That's going to be the internet. Now, initially started as a system in which colleges and researchers and communities like that could connect and share research and data. It begins being opened up to the wider population across the United States and across the world. And this new communication is going to change things like never before. Communication is going to boom. And then this tech boom is going to spark even further with new companies operating on the internet. Basically, if you created any internet company in the early 90s, it was going to skyrocket. But eventually that busts and this dot-com boom has a massive crash. But kind of the biggest marring of Bush's presidency is going to come down to what become known as the Rodney King or LA riots. Now, this is kind of the most conspicuous domestic event that will hit the Bush presidency. Now, Rodney King was a black motorist who had been savagely clubbed and kicked by police officers while being arrested after a car chase on March 3rd, 1991. Now, unbeknownst to the officers, they were being captured on video. This video gets out, and this is going to cause massive violence across LA. The disorder revealed multiple tensions among other ethnic groups, like the Koreans and African Americans as well. It was far more complex than the Watts outbreak in 1965. African Americans from South Central LA participated, but so did Central Americans and Mexican American immigrants in adjacent districts who accounted for about 1/3 of the 12,000 arrests. In addition, white bystanders as targets or became targets of violence. Members of competing minority groups such as Koreans will begin targeted, and Koreatown will be hit very hard during these riots. Now, I have a video linked. You'd have to rent it, but I highly recommend it. It's one of the best videos during this time. It's all using live footage from the time. It's called LA 92. So I highly recommend watching it. It's not required for the course, but I think it would be a great thing to watch to kind of fill in this stuff and kind of show the social, the political, the racial issues all bubbling up in LA during this point in time. But we'll stop there for this lecture, and we'll pick up with Bill Clinton and kind of the rise of the age of terrorism next class.